Welcome to the Monday's broadcast of MB Today. I'm Marc Baker, and in today's broadcast, we're going to begin to look at the eye of faith. You know, we go into the Gospels and we see Jesus operating supernaturally. We see the miracles, we see the signs, we see the wonders. But how did he do that? Is it possible for us to operate as Jesus operated? Is there something specifically from his ministry that we can pull out and look at it? If you look in John chapter 14, and we'll just start there, and looking at this, Jesus says in verse 12, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, that he that believes on me, the works that I do shall he do also. And greater works than these shall he do, because I go unto my Father. And whatsoever you shall ask in my name, that will I do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask anything in my name, I will do it." But he said that the works that he did, we should be doing also. But why are we not doing those works, friend? I would submit to you that it is because we do not know how to look through the eye of faith. So in today's broadcast, we're going to begin looking at that, digging it apart, seeing how Jesus connected to the eye of faith. We're going to begin in John chapter 6. And I'm going to look at the end result of a miracle, and then we're going to go back and look at the miracle over in Mark's gospel, in Mark chapter 4. And we're going to spend some time over this next week picking it apart and just seeing what kind of truths we can pull from this, to see if we can learn how to operate by faith. You know, we see like in Corinthians where we're told to walk, that we're called to walk by faith and not by sight. You cannot honor God walking by the flesh. You cannot honor God walking by the flesh. For did not the writer of Hebrews tell us, without faith it is impossible to please our Father? Faith is the tool. Faith is the tool. We look through the eye of faith. We see the Father's ability. We look through the eye of the flesh. We see the enemy's ability. Which eye we look through will determine the result. For those who want to enter into the works of the Son must train themselves to look with the eye of faith. The eye of faith enables us to see through the storm. The eye of faith enables us to see the miraculous. The eye of faith sees the answer when no answer is visible in the natural. The eye of faith will enable us to overcome. Did not the Master tell us that in Mark chapter 11 and verse 23, that those who speak from a heart of belief shall speak to the mountain, and the mountain shall move? For this to happen, we look no further than the mustard seed. The mustard seed grows deep roots. The mustard seed grows deep roots before a plant is produced. So too those who will develop their roots in the Word of God. So too those who will develop their roots will build the foundation upon which faith is built. We build the foundation by planting the Word. The Word is the seed. The Word is the seed sown into the soul prepared as we yield to the tongue of the Spirit. The soul prepared as we yield to the tongue of the Spirit. For the eye of faith is built on the foundation of the Word. We take the Word, we sow it in the soul. We take the Word, we sow it in the soul. We yield to the Spirit, we begin to speak forth the utterances He gives. Faith is built. Faith is activated. Faith enables us to overcome. Faith is the victory, for the victory has been won. But faith is our response to that provision which was given by the Son in the atonement. For all has been given, but not all is accessed. For we spend not the time meditating upon the Word, we spend not time with Him who lives within. He longs to guide, He longs to lead, He longs to show us the way. But we know not him this day, because we do not understand the quiet place. We do not understand how to yield to him. He will teach us how to flow. He will teach us how to go. And he will show. But only if we spend time. If we spend time with him in that quiet place. For it is those who will separate, those who will wait, those who will spend that time in the presence, that will see, and they will begin to know. Revelation will flow. He will teach. He will guide. And with the eye of faith, they will enter into the works of the Master. The greater works will begin to manifest. They will see. They will know. They will understand. He will show and they will grow. And into the supernatural they will flow. For time is short, time is short. The last grain at hand shall soon fall. The sun shall soon return. The trumpet shall sound. But a glorious church will he find? For the glory is being held back, because carnal the church has become. The Father knows the glory that he desires to send will be something his children cannot stand. For carnal we have become. We do not know him who lives within. We're not yielded to him. We're not yielded to him. He longs to show. He longs to teach. He longs to guide. But with him we do not spend time. Time is short. Time is short. Soon that last grain shall stand. And when it falls, the age will end. And with him we will be called. For that trumpet shall sound. The church shall be gathered. And to the wedding feast we shall go. But so few understand and know. For he lives within. He longs to show. He longs to guide. He longs to teach. But to him will we yield. To him will we yield. Well, friend, I want to go to John chapter 6. And we're going to specifically, for the next few broadcasts, be looking at the feeding of the multitude. I want to look at the end of it here, and then we're going to move forward. We're going to kind of dig it apart, as I said at the top of the program. But we go in, and we'll start in verse 5. It says, when Jesus then lifted up his eyes, he saw a great company come unto him. He said unto Philip, when shall we buy bread that these may eat? Now, for context, Jesus had gone over the sea into Tiberias looking for a desert place. He was looking for a place to get aside with the disciples, to be alone, because it had come to him that his cousin John, who we know as John the Baptist, had been beheaded by Herod. Obviously, this struck Jesus, so he pulled his disciples, they got into a boat, and he was trying to find a quiet place. The people heard about it. And it doesn't say necessarily in Scripture, but it kind of gives you the impression that he had a certain place he liked to go to be alone because they knew where he was headed. So people began to run along the seashore to meet him at his destination. His goal was to find a place to be alone and quiet, away from the crowds. But by the time he arrived, he found this great multitude. And so he arrives at the shore planning to be alone with his disciples. He is greeted by this great company of people. In Mark's account, we'll see that it talks about there was 5,000 men. That's not including women and children, so there's a good chance there was probably 10, 15,000 people in this crowd. So notice what happens here. Jesus asked the question, when shall we buy bread that these may eat? Now, in context, if you look at the other accounts, this is in Mark's account, Matthew has an account of it. Jesus spent the entire day, he was greeted by this multitude. There was sick among them. He was moved with compassion. He spent the day healing the sick, teaching them, feeding them the word. And it's starting to get to eventime. And the disciples came to him and asked him to send the people away because, well, this is a huge crowd of thousands, probably 10, 15,000 people, and they had nothing. And, people are going to get hungry. They're going to want food. So they told him to send the people away. But Jesus responds, when shall we buy bread that these may eat? And notice what it says in verse 6. This he said to prove him, talking about Philip, for he himself knew what he would do. How in the world did Jesus know what he was going to do when he's facing this huge multitude of people. He knew by the eye of faith. And we're going to see that in Mark's account. But again, I want to start with the end and move backwards. So it goes on to say, Philip answered him, 200 penny worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take it. If you look at it, calculated out, 200 penny worth of bread probably would calculate to today's dollars somewhere around $50,000, $60,000. You got thousands of people here. They don't have McDonald's, they don't have Burger Kings, they don't have restaurants. And Jesus is telling them to go buy the bread to feed all these people. I mean, that's going to take a lot of money. Where are they going to get this money? It says, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said unto him, there's a lad here which has five barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many? I can picture Peter standing there. Peter always had something to say. I can picture him standing there with his wallet upside down to show Jesus, it's empty. You're telling us to go buy bread, but we have no money to buy the bread. So Jesus tells them, make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in that place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. Jesus took the loaves. When he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that sat down, and likewise of the fish as much as they would. When they were filled up, he said unto his disciples, gather up the fragments that remained, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. Now, one thing that's important here for you to understand is in verse 11, in John chapter 6, verse 11, it says in verse 11, Jesus took the loaves, when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were set down, likewise of the fishes as much as they would. So you have 5 loaves, 2 fish, able to feed 10,000 plus people as much as they would want to eat. These people weren't getting just scraps. They were getting as much as they desired to eat. And we'll look at this deeper, but notice it says that Jesus gave to the disciples, Jesus blessed the bread, Jesus gave to the disciples, and then the disciples distributed. Now, I do not believe, and we'll talk about this in more detail, but I do not believe that food multiplied in Jesus' hands. Because if it did, then he'd have these huge piles of food sitting around him, and the disciples would be running back and forth. And when you look at it, if you just took 10,000 people, I've done the math on this and looked at it, you'd have about 800 people per disciple. I mean, can you imagine if the food was multiplying in Jesus' hands and the disciples had to keep running back to Jesus to get it? It would take hours upon hours to distribute to all those people. By the time they got done to the last person, people would be getting hungry again that had eaten it first. No, the food did not multiply in Jesus' hand, friend. Jesus blessed it. He took the 5 loaves and 2 fish. He distributed it among his 12 disciples and told them to go feed the people. It was as they distributed to the people that the food multiplied. They didn't run out. They were able to go to the thousands of people. That's the only way this miracle could occur, because otherwise you'd be looking 10, 15 hours. And in Mark's account, it tells us it was already even when this was coming, which means it was between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, and the sun was already beginning to set. But notice now, this is the end. I want you to look at this. Those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, this is of truth, that prophet that should come into the world. When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain alone. And when even was come, his disciples went down into the sea, and entered a ship and went over the sea towards Capernaum, and it was now dark, and Jesus was not come to them. But notice that the people saw this miracle. Their response was natural. They wanted to make Jesus a king. He perceived. How did he perceive? I would submit to you that would be through the eye of faith. What was in their heart? Now, if we go back to John chapter 2, this gives us kind of an impression of what was going on here. In John chapter 2 and verse 23, it says, now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover and the feast day, many believed in his name when they saw the miracles which he did. But notice his reaction. It says, but Jesus did not commit himself unto them, because he knew all men, and needed not that any should testify man, for he knew what was in man. So in this case, they saw the miracles, and they wanted to join themselves to Jesus. Not because they saw him as the Messiah, but they saw in him the answer to their needs. Then at the feeding of the multitude, They decided they were going to make him king because he fed them. And he was able to depart and get away from the crowd. But they weren't coming to him because he was Messiah, because they loved him, because they desired for him. They came to him because their needs were being met. It was all very selfishly focused. This is something I'm noticing in the church today. It's almost like there's this magic formula that if you drop money down into the bucket, this magically you're going to have all your needs met. I talk to people who give solely because they know that's the way to get their bills paid. That's wrong, friend. We're not pursuing him for what he can give us. We're pursuing him for a relationship, for who he is. We need to understand that. That's so very important. So I've heard people talk about the fact that they tried to make Jesus king and he walked through the midst and everything, but you have to understand that was in response to the feeding of the 5,000, which we know was the men. There might have been 10,000. That was the response to the miracle, and it was wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. We pursue the presence, to pursue the relationship. Jesus said in John chapter 17, verse 3, this is eternal life, that you might know him, that you might have a relationship with him, that you might spend time with him. It's fascinating to me because when you think about it, in John chapter 3, verse 16, it says, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. He gave Jesus on the cross. Jesus gave himself on that cross. Jesus made a choice to go to that cross because he loved us. He gave everything. The Holy Spirit told me this once. God gave everything when he gave Jesus. And the only thing he asks from us in return is time. You don't have to take communion to please him. You don't have to attend church to please him. You don't have to do this or that or all the other religious hoops the religious tradition puts us through. He just wants you to spend time with him. That's how we develop relationship. But as we're talking about the eye of faith and looking at this, let's go over to Mark's account. And today we're kind of going through and building kind of a foundation. But I want to go over to Mark's gospel and look at this in context. Now, for background, Jesus is just entering into his second year of ministry. The first year of ministry was spent gathering the disciples together. Matthew, we don't believe, was called to be a disciple till Jesus' 12th month of ministry. When he went to the wedding feast where the miracles began, we see this in John chapter 2, there was probably only 3 or 4 disciples with him at that point. He didn't just launch out into ministry and have 12 disciples. He took time to get the right people, to allow the Spirit to lead him to those who should be his disciples. So Matthew now has become a disciple. Jesus is launching into his teaching ministry. And in this day, there's 10 parables recorded. This is unique because it's the only day of Jesus' ministry that there was 10 parables recorded. There are other days where maybe 2 or 3, but on this day, 10 separate parables. It begins with the parable of the sower, which we're not going into. And if you're not familiar with it, I'm moving through a blog series right now on the website, mbmediaministries.net. It's there on the screen for you, where we're talking about the sower sows the word, where we go deep into this parable. And I encourage you, if you're not familiar with it, to go to the website. If you go to the top menu under Read, you'll see the ministry blog. And in that, you'll have a drop-down menu where you can pick out the series. We have a series on finding the will of God, discovering the will of God, and we have a series on the sower sows the word. So Jesus teaches the parable of the sower. And then we skip down. In verse 33, it says, with many such parables spake he the word unto them as they were able to hear it. But without a parable spake he not unto them when they were alone. He expounded all things to his disciples. The same day when eve was come, he said unto them, let us pass over unto the other side. And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship, and there were also with him other little ships. So we're coming out of the beginning of his ministry. There's a storm. He's wanting to go over to the other side. And this is before the feeding of the 5,000, but we're backing up to the very beginning as he's launching out into the ministry, the first trip of the disciples. So he says, let us pass over to the other side. Jesus in John chapter 8 tells us that he only said those things he heard the Father say. The reason he told them we're going to pass over the side because he heard it. Seeing with the eye of faith, hearing with the ear of faith. He heard it, he said it. So they get into the ship to go over to the other side. And this will be important for later when we get deeper into the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, which we've already started doing, but we're introducing some important topics in this lesson today. So he tells them we're going to get into the other side. Notice in verse 37, there rose a great storm of wind and the waves beat into the ship so that it was now full. And notice his reaction. He was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And they woke him and said, Master, carest thou not that we perish? So get a picture of what's happening here. They're in the boat. This is an open boat. Jesus didn't have a private compartment. A great storm came up. Jesus had said, we're going over this side. Why? Because he heard the Father say, so he said it. When he said it, there was creative power released. How did he hear? He heard with the ear of faith. He took time to listen. We're going to see with the feeding of the multitude how this correlates to that. He didn't just say that to say it. But because of that, he had entered into the Father's rest. The storm is beating against the ship. The ship is probably falling apart. It's filling with water. It's looking like it's going to sink. The disciples are panicking. They didn't come to him and like, you don't love us, you don't care about us. They were upset because the ship is filling with water and he's not doing his part to help them bail out the ship. See, they weren't considering the fact that Jesus had said, we're going to the other side. They were considering the storm, they were considering the waves, they were considering the wind, they were considering the rain, they were considering the water filling their boat. The eye of faith enables you to look through the storm. We're going to see that. Jesus said we're going to the other side, so he was resting in that. I can just picture my mind. If that storm had continued, the boat had fallen apart and sinking, Jesus would asleep on his pillow would have floated right up on the shore on the other side. Because he had said, we're going to the other side. He didn't say, I'm going to the other side. He said, we are going to the other side. If the disciples had just trusted in that word, but you know that, like I said, the first year was spent gathering disciples. They didn't have much experience with Jesus. They didn't know Jesus. They didn't understand Jesus. And they were not considering what he had said. We're going to see at the end of the series, we're going to see a second storm that followed the feeding of the multitude. And we're going to see a different reaction to that storm because now they'd had time to travel with Jesus. When we're talking about the feeding of the multitude, this is at the beginning of the third year of ministry. So they'd have more than a year of traveling with Jesus. They'd been in the services. They'd seen the miracles. They'd, seen so many things and heard Jesus teach. But here they were just starting out. Most of them were just starting out. Some of them had been traveling for a few months with him, but the majority had not. And they were panicking, and Jesus is asleep. And notice what happens. In verse 39, when he rose, he rebuked the wind and the sea, said, peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said unto them, why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? And they feared exceedingly and said unto them one another, what manner of man is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? So I've heard people talk about, and I've seen when storms have come. I live in Florida, there's hurricanes. Our first reaction is we're all going to get up as a congregation. We're going to speak to the storm. Did you hear God tell you to speak to the storm? Jesus only said those things he heard the Father say. He said, we're going over to the other side. When he spoke to the storm and said, peace, be still, it was a response to the disciples' unbelief. He obviously heard something new from the Father. He obviously received new direction. How did he receive it? Through the eye of faith. He said in John chapter 5 and verse 19, I only do those things I see my Father do. So when he was woken up, he had been resting in the promise, we're going to the other side. He obviously either heard or saw himself speaking to the storm, so he got up and he spoke to the storm and immediately was still. And they marveled at that. But he didn't just speak because there was a storm. He was not driven by the need of it. That's an important thing when we're talking about the eye of faith, is to understand it's not driven by the need. It's driven by the Father's voice. And if you're not learning the quiet place, if you're not learning to be still when there are no storms, it is going to be very difficult when you're sitting in a storm trying to listen to his voice. So when we look at this, Jesus only only spoke to the storm because of their unbelief, not because that was his first action. His first action is we're going to the other side. It was only in response to the disciples because they weren't considering the word that Jesus had spoken. Now, as we dig into this and go further, we're going to start looking at this, and we're going to start seeing that Jesus in his ministry had a partnership with the Holy Spirit. He operated and he spoke in conjunction with the Spirit. Too often we speak just to speak what we've heard others say, or we just speak because we're driven by need. The disciples were being driven by need when they woke Jesus up from a deep sleep and like, don't you care about us? You're not bailing out the water. But they were being driven by need. I can just see Jesus because he's in the peace of that word he had given. We're going to the other side. I can see him waking up, yawning, and looking, maybe even taking the time to stretch. Who knows what he did? But Jesus woke up, he looked out, he saw what was going on. He sat up, he said, "Peace, be still." You see, Jesus, one thing we're going to see as we get deeper into this, Jesus didn't respond immediately. He walked in lockstep with the Spirit. So in John's account of the feeding of the 5,000, we see that the response was the people wanted to make him king. Why? Because he had met their need. Not because he was the Messiah, but because he had met their need. He had fed them when they were hungry. Then when we went back to John chapter 2, we saw in response to the miracles, they joined themselves to him, but he knew what was in their heart. Then in Mark chapter 4, he only spoke to the storm in response to the disciples' unbelief. In tomorrow's program, we're going to go to Matthew chapter 14, and we're going to start digging apart the feeding of the 5,000. We're going to look at the story in much more detail. But friend, right now we're out of time. So as we close out, let me remind you once again that you can live your life to the fullest, walking by the faith of the Son of God.